You're not allowed to get nervous.
Oh, I won't get nervous.
Don't worry about it.
Just give
And
me
you'll be able to feel the people.
Yeah.
We're going to do a live calling, but I don't have enough staff today, so.
I've been on the radio.
Okay. And feel free. The idea is to get the truth out.
Okay. That's me. As I said in my letter,
And any reference to history is great.
Okay.
All right? That's what's most important. Because we need to tell people about the
Flesh it
history of
out.
the Catholic Church in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Because you find most people that have been raised Catholics, they go astray so much easier than people coming from different denominations.
They've been kept ignorant, which is unfortunate. Yeah. But as I said to Graham, as adults, we have a responsibility to find out. Yeah. So.
Welcome to the show. This is live from Manhattan Neighborhood Network, and today's guest, an old friend, of course, Graham Weatherspoon. And today's guest is Michael-Vincent Crea. Crea. I had it right first time, didn't I? Crea. And he's a pastor, and we're going to talk about the Catholic Church, which has been in the news quite often, and the abuse of most seminary students. This is a particular sensitive subject because it has to do with sexual orientation, date rape, and all the other things that we talk about in the secular society. And to hear about these sort of things in the church, and in particular the Catholic Church, is disturbing to all of us, for one, because Catholicism has always been noted as being a haven for our children. I mean, everybody goes to Catholic school. That's one of the best things you can do. Even in Harlem, my grandkids are going to Catholic school. You can find that they've always been able to take care of our children. Now, with all this public exposure of the sexual habits of most priests, and celibacy, which seems to be a difficult problem anywhere. I mean, most humans, it's not natural to be celibate as far as I'm concerned. Even loving God as much as I do, celibacy, I don't think I could commit to that. Michael, give us an idea of why you're here, for one, and this explosive story that you have to tell us, which you've kept silent for so many years.
Winston, first I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to be with not only yourself and with Graham, but with the audience, so that we can elucidate on a lot of things that are reduced to sound bites. Mm-hmm. And I do appreciate the time that we'll take today. I hope all of us can share in such a way that it gives a little bit more credence not only to people's faith, mm-hmm. but how even institutions like the church can falter and yet still revive. In my own life, that has been the case. I graduated from college at Cornell University and had all my life wanted to become a priest, so left Cornell in '77, proceeded to start studies at St. Joseph's Seminary in Dunwoody, Yonkers, and I had been in second theology, which would have been my second year, and it just happened that during the spring of that year, an upper-class person, an upper seminarian, had taken me out to dinner, kind of wined and dined me, and now I know from other victims or survivors through incest or rape, institutionally speaking, what was actually going on at the time. And I was basically brought back to his room and raped. And it was something one didn't speak about. It was something one shoved into the inner part of yourself, and guilt, shame, intimidation, a hierarchy of holier than thou would make an individual feel smaller. And I said, how could this happen, you know? And at the end of the semester, I had left. I pursued my calling because I still felt, you know, in whatever had happened, that God has forgiveness at all times. And pursued looking into other religious communities and had discovered the Paulist Fathers, Their mother church is here in New York, 59th Street and Columbus Avenue. And I had visited their church on Memorial Day 23 years ago, and found out that they're the first American-found group of priests. That their founder was Isaac Hecker, formerly whose family had Hecker's Flour. And he left, or he went to the most conservative pope of the 19th century and asked to start his own community, preaching to people in their own language, which hadn't been done, and using English and reaching out in an ecumenical way that didn't happen until 100 years later with Vatican II, which was the global conference of bishops back in Rome that John the 23rd had between 1962 and 1965. But Hecker had this vision. It was part of America with Horace Greeley, educational side, and then other evangelical preachers all across America with a great revival with the turmoil, the war, just like we're hearing now with our war, of the upcoming Civil War, you know, the country on the brink of warring at one another. So Hecker had a really interesting spirituality, charism, because his charism wasn't based on Mary. It wasn't based on St. Francis like the Franciscans. It was based on the Holy Spirit. And I had already written about a spirit-engendered spirituality, that no matter who you admire, the spirit comes, or your spirituality comes from your innermost being, where resides, you know, the spirit. We call ourselves the temple of spirit. Well, I went down for a visit to their Washington, D.C. seminary, and during that visit, someone had taken me under his wing, so to speak, for the weekend, and I was invited to his room, and the first thing he did was lock the door and then proceeded to make some statements that at this time I would call threatening, and touched me in ways and wanted me to touch him in ways that I didn't want to. It was terrorizing. It was something that except for that, and except for the fact of getting on the train at Union Station to head back from New York, and this was then a whole 24 hours later, because this had happened on a Saturday afternoon. That's all I remember of the weekend. And yet I was accepted by the Paulists. And again, I didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do, and yet had that calling again to serve God as a priest, as I had from early childhood.
Now, let me interrupt you for a minute. Now, you're telling us that you were raped.
Yes.
And as a result of that, you left the Catholic Church and went to the Paulists.
No. I left study at the New York Archdiocese Seminary.
Right.
The New York Archdiocese, with Cardinal Egan as its present head, is 10 counties in New York: Staten Island, Manhattan, the Bronx, and 7 upper counties.
I see.
Their seminary is for diocesan priests. Then there's also priests that we call religious priests, or the religious orders. They take sometimes specific vows and specific disciplines that you're what we would call a secular priest or a diocesan priest would not ordinarily take. They also perhaps have special charisms in their prayer or in their ministry. For instance, the Franciscans really work with the poor. The Jesuits work in education. The Paulists work with evangelization. And so I had said, no, this was not the kind of ministry I wanted to do that I found or I had grown up with. Because I had grown up with some great preachers, and that had really affected me and inspired me. And so I discovered the Paulists, and I checked them out. But then after this experience, I didn't know what to think. I worked on my friend's dairy farm for 6 months. And I remember driving a tractor, a 9-ton tractor, and not cursing God, but I remember I was spreading manure that was more manure that added to my problems, saying, why do you have me doing this? Am I the prodigal son? I didn't ask for any inheritance, you know. But then I decided to go back in. But what I didn't realize, that only took counseling and openness and recommitment both to God and myself, because I can't love either of you or anyone in our community unless I love myself.
Right.
So the first thing you learn as a pastor, you can't give care to other people if you're not taking care of yourself. So I kept pursuing, trying to work this out. Part of it was working out my own sexuality. Okay. And I always felt my same-sex attraction to men, that would be, was just situational. Oh, I was in an all-boys high school, or I was in an all-male seminary. And so those feelings I never knew how to deal with.
Well, tell me this. Now people are going to say, well, he has that sexual orientation, so you probably had something to do with this date rape, you called it?
Yeah, I would call the New York situation a date rape.
Date rape. Was it a date?
Well, I mean, I didn't have much money. The guy had more money. He was kind of like your all-American Joe, blonde hair and whatnot. And, hey, you want to go out to a movie? Sure.
Well, were you sexually attracted to him?
No.
There was two guys going out to the movies.
Yeah. And
that's all?
Yeah. I mean, he was good looking and everything. I admired him because he was like, everyone admired him. But, no, I wasn't into him particular. So it wasn't any attraction per se in that regard.
Well, maybe you had...
And the other thing is, the victim is often condemned, or the victim is often made suspect. Anyone who touches anyone without their permission, under force, is wrong. Well, it's not only wrong, I was very happy the Pope finally said, it's a crime. And we, as a church, and I think in many other ecclesiastical or church communities, have often given leeway, especially to their clerics, whether they be Protestant ministers or whoever, or Catholic priests, the benefit of the doubt, because no, they could not be doing anything wrong. Well, and rape is always a matter of control and force, authority and manipulation. And I was basically a little drunk. I was basically compromised. I had let my guard down. And, you know, you feel like you're with someone safe. And
well, a lot of people
occurs.
say that you got yourself in that particular situation and perhaps asked for it. But see, the basic problem in the church now, we're talking about children. Now, they'll say, well, you were an adult, and most of the kids that have been sodomized and raped were below age.
I would agree with you right now. Unfortunately, the discussion has focused and been very myopic. In other words, only one point of view on our children, and they're our first priority, right, because that's where we inculcate our values, that's where we inculcate or teach our trust, and that's where our future is, and that has to be guarded with the utmost. However, when you guard it so much, like other people, until I got in the seminary, there were questions that were never raised as a child. How many of us had a birds and bees kind of talk or no talk from an adult? You know, whether a father or mother, was the father or mother present? Was it single family? Was it grandparents raising it? So a lot of times these discussions didn't go on. Personally, I knew down deep in my heart, I always wanted to be a priest, so I always said I had to be celibate. And frankly, I never dated. I never dated in high school. I never dated in college, but for 2 times. And then I would say when this occurred, when I look back at it, and even my attraction to this guy being the golden boy and people looking up to me and, hey, man, he never paid any attention to me, he's taking me out, isn't that swell? I have another friend. Because even now, I have some views that people would probably call radical, or at least I try to do, as St. Paul says, the truth with charity. No matter how hard the truth is, it's the truth. And the thing that I would say of myself at the time, I was sexually immature. Okay. I was sexually unaware. And when you are brought up to just, be a good boy, so to speak, let me give a very prime example. I pray for him every day since this crisis. Dante Stokes, the young African-American man in Baltimore, shot a priest, former priest named Blackwell, it's about 2 months now. I've prayed for this young man every single day. Here's a young African-American man at 17 years old. He was a junior in high school, going to Bible study, and he was molested. Did he ask for that? Did he want that to happen? And then he goes to the authorities, not only church but civil. They don't investigate, or they say there's lack of evidence the first time. He goes the second time, and now even the DA's office or the courts have lost a lot of the information has been reported. And all he wants is an apology. Look me in the face and say, you did something wrong to me. That was something you could never even expect. And this was back in 1979 and then 1980. That's when the height of this crisis was hitting the church. And sadly, the church did not listen to some of their key advisors.
Well, tell me, let's update ourselves about what's happening today. What's your take on what they're doing about it? Are you saying to us that homosexuality is prevalent in most seminaries?
No, I wouldn't even make a statement as that, because I don't think it's pertinent when you're talking about...
well, that's what they're accusing the church of having.
No, I don't think that. I think it's wrong. And earlier you had said most priests are like involved, and they're not. What I think is the focus is, one, pedophilia, and that is an abnormal instinct response, or more than instinct, because it's psychological, response to children that are prepubescence. And for the audience, that would mean before one starts having the maturity of their sexual organs, causing them to have the wonderful feelings, should be wonderful feelings, of being attracted to another human being. And for girls, it can come earlier, 10, 11, 12. For boys, it comes a little later, maybe 13, 14, sometimes earlier. I know friends that
11
earlier. Sure, and that's part of our new knowledge too, because so often we're still putting old, even scriptural formulas back from thousands of years ago that didn't have some of our scientific understanding, which God works with both reason and faith into our present day understanding. So. Pedophilia deals with prepubescence. Then you got the problem of priests, deacons, bishops who have compromised, raped, incest. I call it incest because it's within a faith family. Teenagers, and have had that attraction.
Have you been witness to any of this?
Yeah, and that's what some of my outrage has been, and trying not to be outrageous in expressing it to the bishops, is that when I finished my Masters of Divinity on my own, and so I have a professional Masters of Divinity, I'm a professional pastor, I did not choose to get ordained because I didn't want to put new wine into old wineskins. So I said, I do feel called. I have learned since I was a child there's more ways than one to serve God. When I graduated from Catholic University of America in 1987, I began working at St. Teresa of Avila Church in Washington, D.C., and it was under then Pastor George Stallings, who later...
Stallings?
Yes, he later founded his own African-American Catholic church.
He just got recently married and had a child.
Oh, that's news. Congratulations, I guess.
Stallings?
Stallings, George Stallings. Yes. But the difficulty in that situation when I was there is that, again, we have to use history. Faith is not lived outside of current events or history. So that was 1987. AIDS had only been out for 4 years. We had been contacted by one very prominent gay black pastor that there weren't...
Let's hold up for a minute. Give me an idea what your purpose for being on the air today is all about. Why are you here?
Too much focus since the Rome meeting has been put on the bishops, on the clergy, and not enough on the abused, not enough on the raped, not enough on the criminality of the charges that have been made. If any other individual had conducted themselves in the way these clergy had, including my own attackers, they would have been at least investigated, arrested, indicted. If you or I and Graham ran a foster care agency, and we were supposed to provide for the children of that agency, and we in any way were found out to be manipulating money or sexual acts against them, our budgets would be frozen. The courts would put an order of protection on us immediately, and this should be done to the bishops. I have written before the conference last week in Dallas, that was June 13th to 15th, where the National Conference of Catholic Bishops met to deal with this issue, and unfortunately I don't think they took their opportunity to really address it because they did not address their own. I had written to Bishop Gregory, the president of the conference, and I said, I called for two things back on May 24th, 3 weeks before the conference. I asked for a bicameral conference, just like we have a bicameral Congress. We have the Senate and the House of Representatives. I wanted to have the bishops, which are about 300 in number, and I wanted to have an equal number of the abused. Because we only were given 3 people who spoke, and that did not give us enough of what this situation is about, clearly to discourse, to discern, and to have decision-making. So I'm here for that. I'm also here because there ought not to be, there's no statute of limitations on the Holy Spirit. And there ought not to be any statute of limitations on these kind of events where, how did I function all these years? Well, sometimes my anger and outrage came out in the wrong ways, and I apologize in those circumstances where perhaps I redirected not knowing that that was the pain that I was projecting onto other people. But we ought not to be able to hold these people accountable because some law written in civil society doesn't protect our children, doesn't protect our women. See, children are a very fanciful thing for the media to play up on. And I'm not lowering their, in any way, their importance to us. But I'm saying women and men who have also been assaulted ought to have not only a fair hearing, but investigations and whatnot. And this has to be applied to the bishops. They're no different. You take off this collar, this is like a police badge. It gives me instant identification and a sense of societal norms or mores that affords me respect. But I got to earn that respect. I have to safeguard that trust. I have to fulfill the call that I've been called to.
Why should they listen to you?
First of all,
where's your proof that you were date raped?
Well,
I mean, I'm playing devil's advocate. Of course.
I have no problem with
a lot
that.
of people in the audience are saying, why is he saying all this? What's the point?
The point,
what
first
gives him
of all,
authority to call these conferences was the fact that you're not ordained. We had a priest on last week, Father Lucas.
Sure, Father Lucas is one of the greatest priests in our city today.
Right.
Point is, the third point I was going to bring out while I'm here is to make my case known and to speak up on behalf of myself. I began by saying I can't give other people care unless I care for myself. And it takes a lot of courage to say I did, you know, I was in,
Excuse me.
I did try to say something but couldn't. I want people to know that, for instance, the seminarian who raped me, when they put him out as a deacon in Mayapack, New York, and I've reported this to District Attorney Piro's office, and I'll touch on that in a little bit later, but he ended up doing something up there, and then they denied priesthood to him. That's one reason I'm coming out, because I don't know where he is right now. Now, the priest who assaulted me in the Paulus, and I must also say about the other person that we're talking about who I was raped by, I spoke to someone since I started talking about this, and they said, Michael, I had to rebuke directly advances that he made to me. So that kind of confirmed to me, had I not spoken up, I would have still been incarcerated in Christ, incarnating Christ. Now I'm hoping to show that I can suffer, and we can suffer the worst things and get over it. And I want every single person who has ever been affected by rape, whether it's by a priest or by a stranger or whatever, to know they can get over it. The second thing then, with the fellow in D.C., he's no longer a Paulist. He left the Paulist community, but he's still a priest. And we're in the process now of contacting Bishop Di Lorenzo, the Bishop of Honolulu, because that's where the fella is from and that's where he's practicing as a priest. Well, perhaps I don't have proof that he did this. However, he's got a history, I have a history. Now, if he's done anything in the last couple of years, and for whatever reason, a child came forward, they didn't believe the child, another person, a secretary came forward, they didn't believe the secretary, maybe I'll be the straw that breaks the camel's back. Maybe me coming forward, like Graham as a retired detective knows, it could be that one thread. We've had people in jail on death row, and now because of DNA evidence, we know that they're totally exonerated.
Well,
so
let's give Graham a chance to.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here today, because when Michael called me, we discussed this on the phone at great length.
Okay. No, you're the reason why he's here.
And I appreciate that.
Okay.
You know, God does a lot of things in and through us. And when Michael called me, I was very much disturbed. And I've known Michael a number of years now. And this is a man who has been serving humanity, not only here, but in the African continent. He has extended his life in many ways to serve his people under the banner of God Almighty. Mm-hmm. I was so disturbed and shaken by the things, and you haven't heard yet the horror of this story.
Okay.
We blame the victims.
Mm-hmm.
Her skirt was too short. She was asking for it. It was her fault. What was she doing out at that time of night? Right. What was she doing in that neighborhood? Mm-hmm. Isn't it true that you were flaunting yourself? Mm-hmm. You know, the Anita Hill situation with Judge Clarence Thomas. And we've often said, well, you know, why wait? It's stupid. 15, 20 years later, you're bringing this up. Right. And I've said that about people with Anita Hill. You know, that was 15 years ago. Why are you talking about it now? Mm-hmm. But Michael made a statement earlier about there is no statute of limitations with the Holy Spirit. And when you are in a position as a priest, as a clergyman, as a rabbi, as a minister, you have a spiritual obligation which supersedes any law in the land. And we need to understand that God and country are not the same thing. We need to understand that in this post-9/11 era, that there's nothing holy and sanctimonious about the United States of America. So let's not put the two in the same box. We have the obligation to obey God before we obey any law of man. And any law of man, as we were saying before, any law of man that conflicts with the laws of God has to be disregarded. That's what Martin Luther King was doing. So when a clergyman becomes that stumbling block, and when Michael told me about what he had been through, and you're talking 20-something years ago, I know women who have been sexually violated by family members and by strangers, and I would never have known that this had happened to them 15 years ago because there was no counseling for them then. And there was no counseling for him. The fact that he has survived it and yet maintained himself to go on and do the things that he's doing, it is phenomenal. And that healing process, the healing process, this is part of his healing process.
Okay.
His willingness also not only to bring it forward, but to forgive the people who violated him is critical to his own existence. My pastor preaches about forgiveness in terms, and we had people in our congregation stand up and state that they were sodomized. They were the victims of incest by family members as children growing up, and there were dozens of them that stood in the congregation. And my pastor says, I want you to go to that person. I want you to tell them, as difficult as it is, that you forgive them. Biblical principle, he says, because if you will not forgive them, you will not be released from the agony and suffering that you're going through. Whether or not they accept it or reject it is not upon you, but you must be willing to forgive them. He says if that person is in their grave, go to the grave site and tell them that you forgive them. At this point, it's extremely vital for your own spiritual and physical well-being. He spoke of stallings. And I've known about AIDS for 25 years. I've known about AIDS.
When they started producing?
25 years. And that was before it had a name. And we need to be clear that AIDS has nothing to do with green monkeys in Africa. It has nothing to do with the homosexual lifestyle. It's not a curse on the homosexual. AIDS is part of the biological and biotechnological research done by the United States and other governmental forces in other countries. And you have been seeing lately with the post-9/11 Fort Detrick, Maryland, with regard to smallpox. This is where this virus was generated. And we need to be very clear about this. This was not some disease that just popped up on the scene. This was developed. It was manufactured by the United States government.
I think it was between 72 and 74. They were looking for a biological agent without a cure.
And this agent has been used by the World Health Organization under the auspices of the United Nations. It was used in 1987 in Central and Western Africa with a small, quote-unquote, smallpox vaccination program where 75 million Africans were vaccinated. And those are the people that you now read about with the AIDS epidemic in Africa. And that is because under this globalization, this New World Order, and all of this white supremacy program, and that's what the New World Order is, it is to eliminate the people from that region of the world because of the great mineral wealth that is there. It's not about going in and rushing in with an army to kill the people. You use a biological agent, a disease, a plague, which eliminates the people from that region.
And tell them how the Catholic Church fits into all this.
Well, I'm going to let Michael continue because this is where the hair on your neck will begin to stand up.
We're going to talk about celibacy. And
well, no, I'd like to get right on the AIDS issue because there's three things. We talked a little bit about celibacy, and we can expand on that a little bit more. The whole thing is married clergy. But the third thing, and it goes back to, as Graham referred to, when I had begun at St. Teresa of Avila, this estranged priest, in other words, he had been basically not in good favor with his own community. He was a religious priest. He came down to live in our rectory at St. Teresa of Avila Rectory in Washington, D.C. His name was Charles Stepney. And I know he had at least served a couple of parishes at one time, or at least said masses over Our Lady of Charity, over on Dean and Schenectady in Brooklyn. But he had come down, and he was just very, it was very strange, because he wasn't incarnated, as far as I know. And incarnated means having the cardinal's approval for him to be there. See, while the Pope is in charge, and then you have individual dioceses, basically the diocese, the archdiocese, if they're bigger, are little fiefdoms. And the person in charge, or like states, and the person in charge, like a governor, oversees what happens. So this fella comes down, and as I said, I put on the first, well, I started the AIDS ministry.
Mm-hmm.
And he was involved with a youngster. As it turned out, he brought this youngster, and I don't know his age exactly, but he was a teen, from Brooklyn, and had him living in the office next to mine. And had also then, before this happened, was, did everything he could to stop or to thwart my efforts to put on the AIDS conference, which George Stallings had invited me to do.
Mm-hmm.
And George had wanted it, and I worked with Craig Harris, who's deceased now, of AIDS. He's a great African-American poet laureate, people that we have to remember, people who were up there, up front in the struggle. Larry Ellis, who was the first African-American to start people living with AIDS. Anyway, Stephanie did everything he could. He even made the statement one day when George and he and I were going out to lunch, well, why wear a condom? Because you're going to die anyway. Now, what happened was, he goes on a Caribbean cruise with this young man, brags about nude sunbathing at a staff meeting. And this is after the conference, which finally went off. And when I started to spout off about it, George washed his hands of the situation, and I was fired. When I went to the archdiocesan authorities, and the authorities that I first met were the chancellor, and this other man at the time, I didn't know who he was. He just basically sat there until when I said I was being racially and sexually harassed, and I was going to put in a human rights case against the church. They didn't believe me. They mocked me for my sexuality. They misstated church teaching. They said, well, if you're gay, they used the word homosexual. If you're homosexual, you can't be doing ministry. I said, that's not what the church teaches. The church teaches, at least morally speaking, that homosexuality, like digestion or being straight, is amoral. It's neither right nor wrong. But the church teaches if you act out on those impulses, they consider it a sin. There are more fundamentalist Christians that feel homosexuality in itself is a sin. But that's not the purpose of right now. They disavowed or were incredulous of what I was saying. I said, call Ray East. Now here's another African-American pastor coming on board who knew me, who knew what I had done, who knew my work, and who knew what was going on. And he said nothing, did nothing. When we went to the human rights hearing, which I had to finally force them to go to, after these two men from the chancellor of Cardinal James Hickey, then the cardinal for Washington, D.C., when they didn't get back to me, I talked to East. He was the new pastor. I have a letter of apology from him and wanted me to come back and revive the ministry, and we beg your forgiveness and all this. He didn't want to pay me. I said, I'm sorry, I'm not going to go through this. But what happened was then,
what's the
this
bottom
guy
line?
Stephanie, well, this guy Stephanie died of AIDS. How many young people did he infect, since when George Stallings started his church, I do believe, and we can go back to the archives of the Washington Post that said he had molested kids in the Cincinnati jail, and I don't know if that's a complete
So how
fact.
long did this go on?
I don't know. He was in the rectory, and I knew if this youngster was there. I complained about it after just about 2 weeks.
Well, what year was this? What was
This was 1988.
So he was how long before he died, after 88?
I don't know, because I had already left the, I was fired March 16th, 1988. And what happened was I had given then the whole file, which I have here.
Mm-hmm.
And I gave this file to Bishop Leonard Olivier, the only black bishop, a Catholic bishop, in D.C. It was returned to me a year later, never having been opened.
But, excuse me.
This is before he died.
Charles Stephanie.
He
We
served at Our
we
Lady
don't
of
need to see
Charity?
that.
He served at Our Lady of Charity in Brooklyn?
No, he has celebrated Mass there. But again, I don't think he was assigned there. And that's been part of my search right now of coming out in the open. I like to find out what community did he belong to. If anyone in your audience knows of Charles Stephanie, I do believe he belonged to a religious community. There might have been some of their children who have died of AIDS, didn't know how they got it. They could have gotten it from him.
But wait a minute. Father Stephanie was at Our Lady of Charity at some
No,
point.
I knew that he had, at one time or another, priests visit other parishes, just like a pastor might go give a revival. A Protestant pastor might go, Baptist pastor, give a revival at this church or that church. I knew that associates here in Brooklyn, the boy's name was Joseph, and he came from Brooklyn. So that's why I say that, you know, he had some association here in Brooklyn. And my concern, though, is here's George Stallings ignoring it, Stephanie living it out. Worse than that, the other person in that room, when I went to see the Cardinal's chancellor, appeared on TV just a month ago when the priest who committed suicide was being buried in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I nearly fell off my chair because now what was just a secretary to the Cardinal is now the Bishop of Bridgeport, William Laurie.
Now,
William...
let's state this again. Now, William Laurie
currently is the present Bishop of Bridgeport who succeeded Cardinal Egan.
Now, this
and
bishop...
he ignored the fact, and I then wrote up a 10-page memo with all the other stuff in it. He ignored the fact that there was a priest in the rectory, in the room next to where my office was, having a young teen live there, having relations with him.
And he had AIDS.
No, this is after the case, after the fact. He died of, Stephanie died of AIDS.
Okay.
I met with Bishop Laurie, now Bishop Laurie, who was then probably Monsignor Laurie at that time, and Father William Kane on December 8th, 1988. I was so distressed by that meeting, first time and only time in my life I didn't go to Christmas Mass. I was so upset.
What have you done about this?
Well,
why did it take till now to come
I'm here.
What? But this is since '88 till now?
No. Well, first of all, I went to the D.C. Human Rights, and Ray East was there, and the personnel director showed up, and they basically stonewalled. I had no attorney, couldn't afford it. I mean, that was my first. You have to picture this. You come out of you come out after getting a Master of Divinity, and this is your first parish. You want to do your best. You're being told you're doing great, at least by the pastor. And then you get fired by someone who's not even supposed to be there, who's molesting a kid. Or at least having relations with the kid. He bragged at a staff meeting that he was nude sunbathing on their Caribbean cruise. So At that time, again, you didn't say anything. I took a bold step going to the Human Rights Commission.
When you were fired?
Yeah,
Okay.
because I never thought I would ever bring anything against the church. But then when I got no satisfaction from the Human Rights, when Bishop Olivier held this material and basically didn't do anything with it for a year and then apologizes to me, but does nothing after that. And I talked to Bishop Olivier a month ago, and I told him of what I had said in the bishop's letter to all of them, that anyone who is knowing or has known to countenance, continued, collaborated in, or covered up any of these activities ought to resign. And I hold him in that way, as even more so, Bishop William Laurie appeared on a local Saturday morning program, and they used him as a spokesperson, saying, well, the church is taking a wait-and-see attitude. Well, the people aren't taking a wait-and-see attitude. Then Bishop Laurie was also, he's on the ad hoc committee for this sexual abuse. And so he's being the spokesperson, and yet he's a hypocrite. He is really, Jesus said they're whitened sepulchres. Well, this is a news update. We're in the 21st century. All these people that say, oh, I'm giving you relief and comfort, we're not talking about rotten bones. We're talking about toilets. That's what they are. They say, sit down and have some comfort. It's like a comfort station, but that's all they're good for. And that's what I think these hypocrites are. And that's what we have to call them. But we have to have the criminal charges met on par with anyone else. Why do I come? I'm equal to the Pope. I'm equal to the President. We're all human beings. They just have an office of authority, but they have to exercise that authority with righteousness, with responsibility, and with reverence to the people of God.
What do you...
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Greg.
You had mentioned something to me, I believe, of a hospice in the Midwest.
Sure.
Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, and this, I just want to show you a headline because this says it all. This says it all. And this is what really upsets me because...
Why don't you just tell us about it?
Well, when you see Catholic priests are dying of AIDS, often in silence. And that's from a Kansas City Star paper, 2000. And one of the best bishops, auxiliary bishops that we ever had in New York was Emerson Moore.
How many Catholic priests do you think have AIDS?
Well, according to this article, it says 11 times the normal population. 11 times the normal population.
Is that because of their sexual orientation?
No, as Graham said, AIDS isn't caused by anyone's sexual orientation. AIDS is caused by a disease.
Well, the spread is by sexual orientation.
Well, I wouldn't say that. For instance, a young black man was accused in Buffalo a couple of years back of assaulting young white girls. Now, at the same time, all right, he had AIDS. Now, whether he knew it or not, the media never said, but they revealed the information which they ought not to have. However, that was like 1999. You go back to 1991 or 92 when he was still here in New York City, and that was when the school board chair, Fernandez, was trying to get the rainbow curriculum in there and AIDS education in there. Had that young man, when he was 11 or 12, been educated, he might never have, or he might have had sex like any other kid, but he may never have been infected. So it's a matter of education. AIDS is a matter of education, just as when I go to Africa, I have to get different shots, but that doesn't mean I just pick up any water from anywhere, because there's Giardia and there's other microorganisms that can, we're very anti-Mexican or Hispanic when we call it Montezuma's revenge and stuff. But that's the slur put on other countries. And it's the same thing with AIDS. You have to know how to protect yourself. We're adults. And if we know how to protect our bank accounts, if we know how to do our stock portfolios as adults, if we buy real estate to make money, why can't we start to mature in our religious faith? How many of the audience stopped really going to formal education? Because preaching from the pulpit is not a class. Sometimes they use it to teach us stuff, but it's not a class in depth about our sexuality, about our spirituality, about our societal relationships. How many stopped at either 8th grade or high school or Sunday school and have never updated themselves? And I think that we're all called to that. A priest getting AIDS, however, in this regard, Bishop Emerson Moore died of AIDS. And it's funny.
Well, there goes celibacy out the window.
Well, you know, Graham talked about what I mentioned to him. And he mentioned Martin Luther. I'll get the Catholic side in here. Thomas Aquinas said 400 years before Martin Luther, and Martin Luther was smart because he followed it. He said, any law that's contrary to right reason, or any law that does not contribute to the common good and is also in sync with the eternal law, is called wicked law and ought not to be obeyed. That was reaffirmed by Pope John the 23rd.
Why don't you insert what the purpose of the celibacy law is?
Well, first of all,
you mentioned off camera.
Sure. Well, celibacy is not a law. Celibacy is a discipline. And by that we mean it's something that people take on in the Roman Church, the Roman clergy, insofar as it's been mandated. Excuse me. There are Catholic priests of the Mennonite rite, which you'd find in Lebanon, of the Orthodox rite, and other Christian communities that are married. Protestant clergy are married. But they started that in the 11th century, the 1000s. Because at that time, cardinals, and this is the historical basis for it. We hear a lot of spiritual rationale. However, the historical basis was cardinals were lay people, as you have deacons or elders in the Protestant church who control the material assets of a church. But because of our fiduciary or our laws now in society, the church property is also protected. But the cardinals were dying and leaving church property to their kin. And so in order to protect property, all right, they instituted celibacy. And
now how would that affect protecting your property?
Because now you have no heirs.
No heirs.
Oh,
and so
Church of Masses.
well, let me say one. Wow. Let me say one thing about celibacy.
But it's not, you know, it isn't, it's...
Well, what my take on it was and why they were doing it. Because if you, I mean, you can elevate your consciousness if you meditate and pray, and you can actually cure your body with being celibate and, you know, generating that sexual energy to purify and cure the body. And I had all these grand ideas that priests were doing things like that, instead of doing all the other things that you're talking about doing.
Well, first of all, let's be clear. Married couples is celibate too. If you're married...
No, I'm saying, I'm saying the purpose, the religious purpose of celibacy for the physical body is to raise your spiritual energy.
That is true.
But you haven't told me any of that.
Because you asked the origins of it.
It wasn't about that.
It wasn't about
That's what he's saying.
That's my point.
Well, it brings up two good points. First, because most of our audience might not even know what celibacy is. What you're saying
lack of sex.
Well, it's not so much even not only having sex. Celibacy, as the church even teaches, is a gift of the Holy Spirit. To have that kind of discipline, you can't, it's not a gift if you force it upon people. So that's why it's disingenuous, and that's why even now, I know priests who are not celibate.
What percentage? What percentage?
I don't know. I mean, percentages don't matter. Know what the most important fact is? We've had 1,000 years of a dysfunctional family or dysfunctional sexuality. It started in the 10th century. Martin Luther, John Wesley, and the other Protestant reformers said, wait a minute. First of all, the pastoral epistles say a bishop should have a wife and family.
We got about 3 minutes left.
Well, he got married. The only thing I want to add to that then, in terms of that, one of the reasons I'm here, and we can get on to this next time, gays have been scapegoated. They say, oh, even from Rome, the spokesperson for the Pope said gays ought not to be ordained because they can't, you know, they're not proper. And they're blaming pedophilia on gays. That's not true. Because it's a matter of giving up sex. I have prayed and fasted since May 20th before writing Bishop Gregory, and have only consumed water every day. Mm-hmm. And yes, it does elevate your mind.
Of course
it does elevate your body. But most of all, it brings you to the depths of your spirit. Amen. That you can live the truth with charity. And that's why, rather than sound bites, I'm trying to continue with you.
Well, it's been another interesting hour with my guests, Michael-Vincent Crea and Graham Weatherspoon. Now, 2 minutes. All right. My point is, the reason why we bring you these interesting subjects, because they're current events, and we all need to know how to deal with the spiritual energy that lies within, and our sexual energy, which is an important part of this. And they should go hand in hand. I mean, sexuality should be a spiritual experience. It should be an awakening of the heart and soul with another person. I don't know about like gender, but I'm saying opposite gender. But I think you have to look within your soul to find how you're dealing with these different topics today. And we thank Michael for bringing this to our attention. We know these things exist. And next week we're going to bring you some other, well, we might even talk about President Bush, and Graham and I have been talking about real villains when it comes to 9/11. Was the CIA responsible for that whole action? Stay tuned, and we'll come back to you with something else exciting and controversial. It's been a Gilchrist experience. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Gentlemen?
Very much appreciate it.
Okay.
We got more. I had,
music?
That'd be nice.
When
All right.
When you mentioned about